Welcome to DRGLT Economics. In this podcast, I want to talk about the great or perhaps not so great decoupling that's taking place in the world right now. I want to divide today's podcast into three sections. First, I want to go over the four areas that I see decoupling taking place, how they are taking place, and what are some of their respective implications. Then I want to talk about what could be the outcome after this decoupling taking place. Can we take it back? Can we unwind it? And what would a divided world be? And finally, I want to discuss, as many of you may also be curious about, who are the winners in this great decoupling and who are the losers. First things first, let's talk about the four areas that I see being decoupled. I must admit that let's name them A, B, C, D. I thought that A would have happened within this decade, whatever the circumstances. B, I thought perhaps would have happened before today's conflict, but after the conflict started, I thought perhaps it would happen to a certain degree, but not after the reactions by the so-called liberal democracies. After that, we see that perhaps this is going to really happen. The latter two, I could not have foreseen them. So what are these? A, the first and the most obvious one is the payment system, the US dollar. This B is economics, trade links. C is cultural, social, and travel. And D is information and communication. Let's go into them one by one. In terms of A, which is US dollar and payment systems, I think I have a whole playlist of podcasts or videos in which I have discussed why I think that dollar has been abused. The position of the United States as the issuer of the world's sole reserve currency, this position has been abused. And it has been abused to such an extent that it's perceivable that within a certain period, a relatively short period of time, the US dollar will cease to be the world's reserve currency. And I think a very important point that I want to make is that the US dollar became the world's reserve currency, and a reserve currency could stay a reserve currency, not because of military power, not because of the coercion of military. There is always this talk, this idea that the US dollar is backed by the 7 fleets, Navy fleets, and the carrier groups. There are some truth to it, but in the long run, for a reserve currency, for a reserve system to function, trust, credit, that's the most important thing. The United States was able to issue the world's global currency, reserve currency, because after the end of World War II, it had the most gold in the world. It had the world's highest industrial output. In fact, I think a statistic that I may be wrong, but I think perhaps 70% of the world's industrial output at certain point was from the United States. The rest of the world were either unindustrialized or in ruins. And so the United States has such an industrial power and such a rich reserve of gold that their dollar, their money, their currency could become the reserve currency. Of course, the United States suffered from Vietnam and also a lot of the social programs, and Nixon had to decouple the dollar from the gold backing. And since then, gradually, the standing of the US dollar actually worsened, right? The United States ceased to be such a dominant industrial power in the world, even though it still is a very, very much important leading industrial power. But its position is no longer so dominant. And worse is, I think, their fiscal policies leading to a level of debt that is really unrivaled, unprecedented in the world. With so much debt and a relatively diminished industrial power, it is conceivable that the trust in the United States is in the US dollar, it would weaken, and over time, the position of reserve currency will be lost. And what surprised me was that I thought that this position is so privileged that elites in the United States would have fought very, very hard to preserve it. But it's really strange. Just what completely amazed me was that they decided to sanction Russia's central bank and to cut Russia off the SWIFT payment system, which is a US dollar-based payment system. And this created a situation that I think by far worsened the trustworthiness of the US dollar. Right? I thought perhaps Russia at some point may themselves distance themselves from SWIFT, and they have been already since last year, I think, been distancing themselves from the use of US dollars. But for the United States to initiate this decoupling itself is really puzzling, and this perhaps signals something that I will discuss in the last part of today's podcast. Now let's move on to the second area where there's this decoupling taking place, which is economics and trade. I thought, because I studied strategy and business policy, and I sort of understand that there are a lot of business thinkers from Europe in particular who have been pushing for the idea of deglobalization. They believe, and I think reasonably so, that for Europe, globalization has been a disaster. It has led to the deindustrialization of Western Europe, and it has benefited, in their eyes, countries or civilizations who do not share the same values as they do. That's understandable, and with the let's say the crisis that we had just lived through in the last 2 years, it is understandable that some of the Western liberal democracies would love to have a more robust supply chain and to have a more robust, more secure economic structure, right? To configure the resources in such a way that it can be more resilient to shocks, exogenous shocks, and that is wholly understandable. And I thought that there will be, to certain degree, some decoupling. There will no longer be so much dependency in terms of supply chain, critical components in the supply chain on some Asian economies, right? And they want to move at least some of the downstream in the supply chain closer to the final product, to perhaps Europe or maybe to North Africa. And in the case of the United States, since it already still is a very important industrial power, it hasn't really been deindustrialized. A lot of the jobs will come back to the heartlands of the United States, and that area, and what I'm talking about, the Midwest, may actually experience a renaissance, and that, I think, is a good thing for these liberal democracies. And at the same time, it can also be a good thing for a lot of the Eastern economies. In terms of Russia, they need to go basically downstream, right? They need to develop their more complete industries. And in the case of China, they need to go up the value chain to produce products, to manufacture products and gain competitive advantage in areas that will have international long-term competitiveness, not just be hinged on capital-intensive businesses or labor-intensive businesses, which in the long run is never a solution, because as your economy develops, you lose the advantage in labor cost, and as your economy develops, you run to a point where further capital investment or growth, the investment-driven approach to economic growth will run into a point where investment and returns you don't have a good ROI, let's just say. So that was the type of decoupling I was envisaging, but the Western leaders completely surprised people like me, and I think perhaps a lot of people who have been paying attention, which is that they are now still escalating. Even in the last few days, they are imposing embargoes on Russia. That is on top of embargoes that have been put in place against a lot of countries. What is so interesting is that after decades of embargoes, right now the United States is going to Iran and Venezuela and asking them to supply oil for the United States. That obviously is highly foolish. It certainly will not work, partly because those countries cannot really crank up their production just like turning a tap, because that the oil and gas industries, there's a lead time, right? You invest some money into you drill some wells, you build up the infrastructure, and then after a few years you can get the oil and gas. Without that lead time, even if they wanted to, and I don't think they want to, even if they wanted to, they could not. So that is really crass, but let's just that's a digression. But this type of embargoes posed on one, I think arguably the most important country in terms of commodities trade in the world. That's just insane. The most industries, the inputs are those commodities. These are the weeds, these are the grains, these are oil, gas, also aluminum, iron ore, and all these heavy metals. These are essential components of a country's industry. And let's make no mistake, it all looks great, it all feels great to have a small country that is a so-called a financial center, without a real industrial base. But that is only it can work if it's a small country, right? It cannot work if it's a real country that is independent, that is resilient. You need to have industry. And to have industry, you need to have these industrial outputs. By posing this type of embargoes, or at least giving the Russians the incentive to cut themselves off, right? Even if you don't do it, you have pushed them to such a point where there's a decoupling in the commodities market. What we can see is that a lot of the industries, particularly in Europe, will see I don't know if it's irreversible, but severe decline. And then in terms of economics, we must also pay attention to airspace being closed, making business visits much more difficult. And of course, a lot of the airlines, the Western European airlines, a lot of them will face severe difficulties. They may go bust. Some of them will. I think perhaps there will be a new round of consolidation, but that is just another money-losing business. And another issue that we need to really consider is the Northern Sea route. Russia has spent quite a bit of money in developing the Northern Sea route. And with this, basically this is an idea of shipping goods from Asia to Europe, perhaps from Shanghai or let's say from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Northern Sea route. I think it's possible to cut, I don't know how many miles, 1,000 miles or something like that of current alternative. And that means that trade could be then more efficient, and you could the economies on both sides, on all sides, right? In Asia, the manufacturers, in Russia, because the operation of the Northern Sea route, and Europe, because of the access to cheaper goods, lower shipping costs. This would have been great, but I think there hasn't been any talk about sanctions against this Northern Sea route. But I think with hostilities growing, I think that the Northern Sea route probably will not really be functioning in the next few years at least. And that means that, trade will be more costly, and of course inflation will be worse. That's just one of the factors. And lastly, when it comes to economics and trade, there are a lot of tech companies, and I see these days, today, also some accounting firms, consulting firms, basically business services in the business service industry. They are leaving the Russian market and Russian and Russian-speaking markets. That is also not a great thing. I think, again, it just facilitates the decoupling in economics, in trade. And then what we would have is that on the one hand, we will have perhaps let's call it the third world or developing world, the South, the global South, even though Russia is pretty much in the North. This group will have a lot of industrial power, a lot of resources, not the best in terms of technology, and not the best in terms of scientific research. On the other hand, we have a resource poor, semi-deindustrialized liberal democracies who have some advantage in engineering and in science, but the gap has been closing. And we're going to see that what could have been in essence, a fair trade, a fair exchange, not having place. And this, by definition, is going to be suboptimal for everyone. And the third area where there's decoupling taking place are in the cultural, social, and travel spheres, right? Because there will be, I think travel will become harder. We will see that cultural understanding between the peoples will weaken. A story I like to tell is that, you see, currently it would be very difficult to imagine a German chancellor talking about or thinking about invading France, right? Sending its panzer divisions on French soil. That's almost, it's unimaginable, completely unimaginable. But if we put up a border between a war between Germany and France, we cut off all the communication channels. We don't allow people to travel. In 1 generation, 2 generations, I think it's possible. It will become increasingly easy to imagine that a German chancellor would say that, you see those, I don't want to say frogs, but I was going to say frogs. Those French people, you know, they are just not nice to us. They are arrogant. Let us send some panzer divisions on Paris and to Paris. And this will be, you know, the analogous can happen. And this is not good, because you see, all things going bad, we have a payment system decoupled, trade decoupled. At least we have some mutual understanding, right? Like during the first Cold War, I think in the West, it was still possible to listen to broadcasts from the Soviet Union, to get books from the Soviet Union, and get newspapers from the Soviet Union. And this, in my judgment, had been the advantage of the West, because the West would at that point know the Soviet Union, while at the same time they had some understanding of themselves. And if you learn from Sun Tzu, it is that you know yourself and you know your enemy, right? And that follows. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was not possible to access those. At least in the first few decades, it was not possible to access information or anything culturally, socially from the West. And this actually weakened, in my judgment, in the long run, the Soviet Union. So however you look at it, this is going to be bad for the world, right? It will cause currently it's going to be just a separated world, but it is possible that in a few decades, it will become opposing worlds, two opposing worlds. And that's can be disastrous as well. And finally, there is this divide on decoupling in terms of information and communications. I'm a small-time critic of China's Great Firewall. By small-time critic, I mean I'm only talking about this with the people I know. But whatever, I'm not really going to post this on Chinese social media, because I know that this will not pass censorship. So I'm just saying that it's not really adding much of a strength to China. Now, of course, in the short term, we can see that with hybrid warfare, it seems to be a safe choice, because the adversary seems to be so strong in waging hybrid war, in disinformation. And it seems like temporarily it could be an interesting, it could be a smart way to insulate oneself, to protect one's population and the society from the assault, from the onslaught of so-called adversary, let's say. But in the long run, if this would continue, then we will again have a cut-off completely opposing sides. And this is also not conducive to long-term stability. And I'm not going to talk too much, go too deep into this. I would never have thought that number C and number D would have taken place. I had in fact heard from China just a couple of years ago that there were pushes within the Chinese society, and in fact from the let's say the toppest, the upmost echelons of the Chinese government, the willingness, the wish to ease down, to ease out on this great firewall, and to allow more American, particular tech companies to do business in China, right? So in essence, to facilitate information, the free exchange of information, to go easy on censorship. But this, I think, after the great decoupling has been kicked off, surprisingly by the West, by the liberal democracies, we are going to see that this, I think, reversal will be aborted, and rather, I think it's the liberal democracies in the West who want to impose such, let's call it, Great War. Well, this is the first section. I think I have gone really, really long on describing these issues, because really it completely surprised me. I thought that there would be some decoupling, certainly, but not in these spheres, so many of them, and not in the manner that they have taken place, the decouplings. But anyway, let's go to the second section. I think this will be more concise, which is a couple of questions. Can we unwind this the decoupling? What are some of the areas it can be unwound? And what could be the long-term consequences if the world stays divided? I think in answering the first question, this is completely my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but I think, I could even be misguided by my own prejudices, right? Or perhaps wishes. But I would think that over some time, when the conflict is over, when the most turbulent period of time is gone, we passed that mark, when perhaps at that point the US dollar will already play a less important role in global trade, perhaps because some other payment system have already carved out a significant share in global trade, right? And at that point, perhaps the economies in the West and in the East would have either built some more resiliencies, or built a little bit more or less dependency on Western consumptions, right? There could be some changes, some reconfigurations. At that point, I could see perhaps an ease on C and D. And particularly, I'm thinking about C, because now we see some very extreme things taking place, like some Russian authors, some Russian conductors being cancelled, right? Some Russian cats being cancelled, Russian athletes being cancelled. This, I think, over time, in a few years, perhaps not very long, I think this will be reversed. Because after all, I think people will have more urgent emergencies or more urgent issues to worry about. And the hate, I think, perhaps will not hold for as long. And eventually, some people will start to resort to reason and realize that perhaps these social and cultural decouplings are excessive. And I also see that perhaps travel will become easy again. Right? I think airspace perhaps will be opened, and tourists will travel, and there will be some cultural exchanges, and mutual understandings can actually resume. So the worst consequences of total decoupling, which is two confrontational worlds, I think perhaps will not happen. I think overall that is the most likely. And then to certain degrees, I think when the heat really cools down, I think perhaps on the information sphere in terms of communications, there will be both sides will be less censorious, less willing to censor, and there will be tools that are currently available, and perhaps new ones will come that will facilitate the free exchange of information, of communications, and altogether this will mean that eventually, in a much longer horizon, we could see that economic exchanges resume to a certain degree. But the long-term consequence of this decoupling is that the dominance of the US dollar will no longer resume. I cannot foresee a future where the US dollar, once decoupled, can become the global reserve currency again. That credit, that trust is lost and is never coming back. Whereas in economics, trade, culture, and whatever, these things, in economics, it is about interest. It's about efficiency. I think in the long term, economic efficiency will win out. In terms of culture and information, that's about curiosity. It's about humanity. I think in the medium term, humanity will win out. So that's my take on, can we unwind some of the decoupling? I think yes, some spheres, yes. But the dominance of US dollar and thereby the hegemonic position of the United States perhaps will be no more. But as I wanted to express this in my previous videos, but perhaps I haven't really made a complete, clear statement, which is that I think the United States will remain a very important power, and I think the US dollar will continue to exist and continue to be one of the currencies to be used, and perhaps even have free exchange, and perhaps when outside the United States, there will still be places where it can be accepted. But it does not mean that the United States, the US dollar will continue to be the reserve currency. I think not. And this actually leads us to the second question, which is, what will be the long-term consequences of this division, right? As I said, if we don't unwind it, then of course it's going to be two confrontational worlds, and we will have 1984, a complete picture of 1984 with a division somewhat resembling that depicted in the novel, perhaps in two worlds, not three, but we're going to have an Atlantic world and an Eurasian world, right? And then there are other countries who are aligned with one or the other. That will be the consequence. If the division is not unwound at all. But I think that in terms of information, as I said, communication, cultural, social, travel, and to a certain extent also in terms of economics, this decoupling will be unwound, or is it unwinded or unwound? I don't know. We will see more exchange, a little bit more integration, and so the real outcome will just be that the US dollar will cease to be the reserve currency, and I think perhaps in the euro will disappear. I think it could happen very, very fast. Indeed, this leads us to the final section of today's podcast. Who are the winners? I think only the military equipment suppliers, the arms manufacturers, the complex that has been warned by many leaders, including a former US president, actually not just one, I think also two. One retired, the other one was assassinated. I think they both talked about the danger of this. But I think their warnings were not heeded, and this has run completely wildly out of control. And I do not think that US interests are served by this grouping, and I think this grouping is supranational. So this, I think, these are the beneficiaries. The small losers are, in my judgment, indeed the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and all the developing countries as a whole. Because if there had not been this great provocation, right? If there has not been this decoupling, if the United States used its position as the issuer of the global reserve currency responsibly, if it used its dominant military position responsibly, then these countries, Russia, China, and all the others, all the rest, would have been able to focus on developing their own economies, in raising their standards of living. And trade will be easier, right? And of course, I can fully understand that some of the advanced economies want to protect their market a bit, right? That is not a full decoupling. That is simply to protect their economy while having some trades. That's just having a rule of globalization or trade that is beneficial to them as well, right? I think it will be beneficial to all these economies, the Russians, the Chinese, and all the rest developing economies. They are the losers, because with this decoupling, their trade partners will be more limited. They have to focus more on the military. They have to endure a slower growth than otherwise, and slower rise of the standards of living. They are the small losers. The biggest loser is the European Union. Particularly, I'm sorry to say this, I think this is it's a country that has been demonized, and because of its history in the 20th century. And it's a country that has suffered a lot, and that's Germany. And I think its neighbors, its Western neighbors, Italy, France, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, these are the countries that are going to suffer. They now are plagued by an ideology that is not really reflective of reality, and they are driven by ideology, and they are so fervent in their belief in the righteousness. And that is really sad, because they are led down this path by, in my judgment, primarily the warmongers, the weapons, businessmen. Let's call them the businessmen. And they will lose big, because if you already look at the exchange rate for the euro, it has dropped precipitously. I think it will continue to drop. And the reason is that it is very, very easy to see that the Eurozone, with one of the highest tax burdens in the world, I mean the highest tax burdens in the world, one of the highest debt burden in the world, one of the highest social welfare burden on the world in the world. So that basically means what is the word? What is the word for that? That is called what is that word? Well, anyway, it's a part of the government spending that's committed. That is one of the highest. And then with an industry that is heavily reliant, the industry that is already largely nurtured, right? Largely reliant on foreign supply chains and on Russian energy and raw materials. Now we have this exogenous shock of rising commodity prices, 11-fold increase in gas prices, doubling of oil price, and aluminum, iron, metals, everything up. That is going to put immense pressure on the industries. That is going to be very disastrous for Europe, because when you have this current situation, the aforementioned combinations, how do you turn it around? And it does not help that in Europe we have actually some of the most rigid systems. In France, there's this system that is set up first by Napoleon and then made worse, in my judgment, by General de Gaulle. A system that is really controlled by the deep state, by people who went to ERNA, and these people are controlling all the major French businesses and the French government up and down the echelons, and that's just completely resilient to reform. How can they change? So that the only thing that can happen, in my judgment, is that there's going to be a huge euro crisis, that the euro will disappear as a currency. And I think in Germany, interest rates will rise, and Germany for a time will be able to cope. But in the long term, it faces a lot of challenges. Germany needs to be reformed, and I think Germany perhaps is able to reform. Maybe not. France, probably it will, after the fall of the euro, the French franc, nobody wants it. It will depreciate, and France will have thereafter to compete with the Asians, with the Moroccans, with the North Africans, and the living standards in France will fall a lot. I think people will at that time not have the advantage of being a close ally of the United States, who issues the global reserve currency, and having the crumbs given to them. It's really sad for the Europeans, and similar is for the Italians. Italy still has a very strong industrial base, and the cost in Italy is relatively low. But I think a period of high inflation in Italy after the fall of the euro is inevitable. Lives will be destroyed, and But on the other side, I think Italy may be competitive again, because I think in Europe, Italy has its own advantages. If you look at the industrial products that's come out of Italy, they do seem to have particular strength in industrial design, and I think that is a strength that perhaps is bestowed to them by their cultural heritage, rich cultural heritage, and is very, very well preserved cultural heritage, and that gives them an advantage in industrial design. And in the global economy in the future, I think perhaps they will still be, there could be actually be a renaissance in Italy. I think that could happen. And then we have the non-Eurozone EU countries. I think, the jury is still out, right? Yesterday I made a podcast saying that there is a risk of radicalization or destabilization in those areas. But of course, if those countries, their governments and their people can be tough enough to resist the calls by the Anglo-Americans to use them as bases for proxy wars or insurgency wars, then perhaps they will remain somewhat stable. And if they can remain stable, I think they could also be players, and especially players if they at some point manage to develop good relationships with the Russians. And I think some of them have, in particular, I think Hungary has reasonably good relationships with China. So it is possible that these countries can act as a bridge between the East and the West, and their economy can then actually benefit. But make no mistake, the biggest losers are the European Union. All right. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast. It's a little bit long. It's certainly longer than I usually do, and this is just because there are so much to talk about. So many arenas, so many areas are being decoupled, and I challenge people to say to give me some evidence that they anticipated that there will be cultural and information decoupling before this has happened, and that these decoupling are pushed by the West. That's completely surprising to me. Anyway, these are some of my thoughts on the issue. I hope that there are some points that I've raised in this podcast that you find interesting. And if you like this podcast or video, please share, and subscribe. By the way, I did dial up on the preamp a little bit. I hope, because I have read some comments saying that the volume on these podcasts, on my recordings, are a little bit low. So today I have dialed it up a notch. Hopefully, this will result in a more clearer recording. I have to apologize, nevertheless, that there may be some echoes still in this recording, and this is because my room is a little bit echoey. It's a little empty, and I don't know if it has to do with the shape of this room. But if you find it still a bit annoying, do let me know. Maybe in the future I will record in another room. Thank you very much, and have a great day.